Thank you all for coming out tonight and enjoying this lecture by Cheri Rae. My name is Greg Reck. I'm the president of the Architectural Foundation, and I appreciate all of you coming out and attending as we continue our commemoration of the 1925 earthquake, which occurred on June 29th, 1925. So our speaker tonight is Cheri Rae, the author of A String of Pearls, Pearl Chase of Santa Barbara. And Cheri is going to offer insight into this iconic figure, Pearl Chase, and how she helped shape the city. And then following Cheri's lecture, we're going to have a question and answer session. And then we will also have refreshments out back. So feel free to stick around. And I want to thank the lecture series committee. We've got Cass Ensberg and Suzanne Tejada, who was taking your tickets as you entered. And then Barbara Burkhart and Ann Dwelly. Raise your hand, Ann. And then Lydia Rayo, who's standing in the doorway right there, our executive director. And the desserts tonight afterwards at the reception are donated by the Berry Man. So that was very nice of them. Continuation of our lecture series next Thursday night, June 19th, local structural engineer Sage Shingle will be here to talk about why buildings fell. And we've got lots of interesting photographs of the damage following the earthquake. And then on June 26th, historian, author, and AFSB board member Betsy Green will be here to share stories the earthquake survivors speak. So she has stories from descendants of the survivors, and then also she's done a lot of research with newspaper accounts. So taking quotes from the survivors as they spoke to different journalists following the earthquake. So that looks to be very good. And then we're going to continue our lecture series into the fall. We've got two events planned for right now. Betsy Green is going to talk about how to research the history of your own home. And she's done that, and she writes the article in The Independent called Thank you, The Great House Detective. I didn't write that down. And then Cheri is also going to be back in the fall, basically a part 3 of her lectures on Pearl Chase. And right now it's tentatively titled, What Would Pearl Do? So essentially, if faced with the city planning challenges that we currently have going on now, what would Pearl do? So that should be interesting. Other Architectural Foundation earthquake commemoration programs include Gimme Shelter, the exhibit that you see on the walls right here. These are like images of the earthquake from 1925, and then other sorts of destruction, man-made destruction over here on this side. And that's by artist Marcia Rickard, and she is here right now if you want to raise your hand. Oh, and I see Betsy's here also. Yeah, so raise your hand, Betsy. Betsy's the one that's going to talk 2 weeks from now, and then also again in the fall. And last, AFSB is also conducting walking tours. We're going to have special evening walking tours Monday through Friday, June 23rd through the 27th. So that's the week before the anniversary of the earthquake. They're going to be starting at 6 p.m. at night from the Anapamu Street side of the downtown public library. And you can make reservations online now at afsb.org or at eq25.org. So hopefully 2 simple websites you can remember. If not, come up and ask me. We also have this brochure, which has more details on the evening walking tour. Okay, we've got those. I think we'll be back on the bar afterwards. And if you want to talk to me about other AFSB programs, because we have programs that go on throughout the year, I can give you this sheet, or I can give you more details. There's children's programs, and there's scholarship programs, and I'm happy to talk to you about that later. All right, so in week 1, last week, Cheri Rae talked about Pearl's life before the earthquake, up to her meeting with Bernhard Hoffmann. Tonight, Cheri is going to share more historic photos, anecdotes, and Pearl's own words on how she worked with Bernhard Hoffmann immediately after the 1925 earthquake to promote the rebuilding in the Spanish colonial revival style, and how Pearl Chase carried on the work after Bernhard left town through the Plans and Planting Commission, and really, I mean, for the remainder of her life. So our speaker tonight, Cheri Rae, is a longtime Santa Barbara resident. She's instrumental in leading efforts to preserve the historic bungalow neighborhood. Most recently, Cheri worked with a team of passionate citizens to preserve the historic stone pines along Anapamu Street, along with Rick Clausen. So, Rick, if you also want to raise your hand, he's the one standing back there behind the projector. Cheri is an award-winning columnist and writes columns for Newshawk. She's a member of the Pearl Chase Society and a longtime editor of the Society's newsletter, The Capital. She's the author, as I mentioned before, of the book String of Pearls, Pearl Chase of Santa Barbara, and the book is available at Chaucer's Bookstore, and we also have copies available tonight that you can purchase for $20. And for those of you that were here last week, as Cass said, we owe a debt of gratitude to Cheri Rae for her tenacious community work, which, as Cheri likes to say, is inspired by channeling her inner Pearl. Right?
No, my marketing person said that.
So I bring you Cheri Rae.
Thank you. Thank you for that very nice introduction. I'm so glad to see you all here tonight. And this is going to be kind of fun because it's going to be a little bit different than you might expect, because you know I love Pearl. And I want to give proper credit now to Bernhard Hoffmann. So this is going to be interesting. How did Pearl Chase of Boston and Bernhard Hoffmann of Stockbridge, both from Massachusetts, end up here in Santa Barbara and transforming this place? That's what we're going to deal with tonight. Okay, so when the Hoffmans came to Santa Barbara, they offered their wealth, their vision, and their experience. And this is a little bit of background that you need to know here. They were married in 1903. It turns out that Irene was the only daughter, only heir actually, of her father, Henry Botsford, who had helped start the stockyards in Chicago. And he was extremely wealthy. And when they were married, he gifted them a 43-acre estate in Stockbridge. And when he passed away, she inherited $8 million from her dad, which is about $200 million in today's dollars. So I had known that she had wealth, and Sheila and I have talked about this many times over the years. What was the deal with Irene? But I had no idea how much wealth they had. And they were extremely generous. And they came to Santa Barbara because their daughter had been diagnosed with diabetes. They knew Dr. Potter from New York City, and he was just starting the clinic, the Potter Metabolic Clinic here, which became the Sansom Clinic upon his death. And Margaret was one of 20 people who was accepted into the program. Now, what's interesting here is Bernhard and Pearl had some overlaps and some coincidence of interest. He was quite a bit older than she was, but both of them, when they met, had already been working with Herbert Hoover. He was working on the food board, and she was working on housing policies. Bernhard, when Bernhard and Irene came to town, they purchased Casa de la Guerra, which at the time was somewhat run down. Oh, Rick has loaned me this. Oh, there we go. Oh, look at this. Oh, how fun. Yes, they purchased Casa de la Guerra, and they had their new home built called Casa Santa Cruz. And she was working on social work. She was, as we talked about last week, she was doing a great deal of social work. And she was always working through organizations. She did not work alone, but she got people together. Bernhard was working with local architects. He had experience with something called the Laurel Hill Association, which we haven't really heard about too much here in town, but we're going to. And she was already concerned about community beautification. When they became partners, he was the idea man, and she was the local woman with the organizational genius. So what he offered was wealth for investments, experience with preservation activities, appreciation for the local community, and he had many, many influential connections outside of the community. She had knowledge of Santa Barbara, local connections, and there was a great deal of respect for her place in the Santa Barbara community. Now, this is the part of the story that was pretty much new to me. Well before Pearl was born, there was a woman in Stockbridge named Mary Hopkins Goodrich. And her intention was, as she put it, let's make Stockbridge the paradise of towns, the joy of the whole earth. 1853, she started the Laurel Hill Association. Well, we all know that Pearl had her defining moment when she was just a college student, and she was ashamed of Santa Barbara's shabby buildings, dusty streets, and lack of landscaping. And then she said, then and there I resolved to make Santa Barbara a more beautiful place to live in. How interesting that this woman from Stockbridge and this woman from Boston here in Santa Barbara had the link with Bernhard Hoffmann. It turns out Bernhard's father had actually worked with the Laurel Hill Association. Bernhard grew up knowing about the Laurel Hill Association, and he actually started a magazine in Stockbridge. And one of the things that he wrote was, the communities thrive best whose civic life is nourished by the heartblood of a devotion that involves self-sacrifice. So for me, this was like an aha moment. It's Bernhard brought this idea of the Laurel Hill Association to Santa Barbara, and they started the Community Arts Association in 1922, shortly after he moved here. Now, I don't think that's a coincidence. Pearl described the founding of the association as a small group of people who felt that the city was, well, do you want me to read this? With its heritage from Spanish, Mexican, and American pioneers and its scenic and climatic advantages, deserved a better fate than most American cities. There were these influential, wealthy people who wanted to put their time and their effort and their money into making Santa Barbara more beautiful and having many more cultural amenities. And when they, in 1924, again, this is before the earthquake, the Plans and Planting Committee was formed. And the book that they created on small house designs, which was Pearl's big interest, was actually dedicated to Bernhard Hoffmann, who at that point then was the president of the Community Arts Association, for his far-sighted, generous leadership in promoting and developing and enhancing the attractiveness of Santa Barbara. This all, again, happened before the earthquake. Carlton Winslow was one of the editors of this thing, and it was already in place. Kevin Starr is one of my favorite historians, and he wrote he has a huge compendium of history of California, and I love what he talks about. With Bernhard Hoffmann serving as chair in Plans and Planting Committee, embarked a prominent program of beautification and improvement that soon put the committee in virtual control of Santa Barbara as a shadow government of vigilante Hispanicizers. I just love that phrase. Santa Barbara thus became the first preservationist controlled city in the nation. That is so significant. And so he had the street in Spain, the Meridian Studios. This was the fountain at his own home, and Casa de la Guerra were all under the vision of Bernhard Hoffmann. As we talked about last week, we had several buildings were built in the Spanish Revival style. Santa Barbara High School, the Libero Theater, which was a project put together by the Community Arts Association, Santa Barbara City Hall, and the El Paseo restaurant, and the entire building. And these are some of the architects that he was working with: Carlton Winslow, Myron Hunt, George Washington Smith, and James Osborne Craig.
Hey, Cheri.
Uh-huh.
That laser pointer
Is it too much?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, I won't use it.
It's an astronomical one.
Oh, okay.
Not good for your eyes.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, well, we don't need it anyway. Okay, sorry, Rick, but thank you anyway. Thank you for saying that. Okay, so June 29th, 1925, Pearl said, importantly, it was after several years of work and demonstration that an earthquake provided an opportunity for citywide laboratory experiment, which aroused more than national interest. So this was already going on. I know that we all keep hearing that it was the earthquake that transformed Santa Barbara. It was the opportunity that allowed them to put their plans in place. And the immediate news, this is the following day: quake claims 9 lives, city to rebuild at once. That was always the message: we're going to rebuild. And this is the cartoon or drawing that appeared in the Los Angeles Times with the plans for rebuilding is in her hands with the pioneer spirit behind her. And that was widely distributed. So interestingly, on the day of the earthquake, we had some important people here in town, including Julia Morgan, who had been through the San Francisco earthquake and already knew Pearl Chase and was actually here in town to talk about her commission to build the Margaret Baylor Inn. And she has some famous quotes about what happened and how she watched the dust coming out, and she got to explore the town after the earthquake, and she called it a great practical experience. And also in town was Bailey Willis, the president of the American Seismological Society. How perfect was that? And he made a new career out of writing about the earthquake afterward, and had an actual exclusive in the New York Times the next day. And he said the earth moved 16 inches, bad buildings were exposed. And he also wrote an article that said that after the earthquake, Santa Barbara was the safest place in the world.
People said he knew.
He knew?
It was coming.
He knew. Well, I'm sure he said that afterward. Yeah. But Santa Barbara soldiered on, carried on, and only 5 days after the earthquake, it was Independence Day, and all the articles are about the quake was part of the evolution, and that, again, exhorting the citizens to keep firm resolve to build a more beautiful city. That was sort of the mantra that was happening. The earthquake is part of God's plan of evolution. Just a few more days after the earthquake, there was the reconstruction dinner that was held at Casa de la Guerra, and it was the Hoffmans who hosted it. And they brought together 75 members of the community and all the architects, city planners, politicos, business leaders, all kinds of influential individuals. And they discussed, what are we going to do? How are we going to make this happen? And that's how they came up with the whole next plan, basically summed up in this statement: a consistent architecture would mean an increasing of revenue and a general stimulation of business. Apparently the economy wasn't that great, and State Street hadn't been that great for a while. So this was this opportunity to enhance the business community.
So we need another earthquake.
There you go. That would solve our State Street problem. So this is the headline of the next day. Hoffman takes the lead in the program, widening of State Street. He was appointed to the Architectural Board of Review, and the focus was on building the business district in the new Santa Barbara architectural style. And this was emphasized over and over. It was for the residents and, importantly, the tourists. This was very strongly a business decision. And then again, community arts leader says quake brings great opportunity. So they had this can-do attitude, just within just a few days. So while I want to give Pearl her due, but while Bernhard and many of the men were making the plans to reconstruct the city, Pearl was focused on that this is her lane, was being a social worker. So she was involved in organizational activities, keeping things going at the recreation center, planning the whole recreation schedule for the rest of the summer to keep the people busy and occupied and having things kind of run as usual. Kind of interesting, it said, the recreation center was that was her office, that was her everything. She operated out of that and brought people together there. That was a central location. That's where the insurance companies and the banks worked out of after the earthquake. And it also was temporary housing for the female inmates who were displaced from the county jail. Now, I've heard Betsy say that some of the inmates, the male inmates, kind of were dispersed or put in other places if they were kind of bad guys. But the women had to go to the recreation center. I guess they put them to work cooking or something. I don't know. Okay. So this is a year after the earthquake, actually, this disaster booklet was published. And I've read enough of Pearl Chase's writing that I know that she wrote the thing. And in the dedication, she wrote and talked about the cooperation of other agencies and groups and how that was the outstanding feature of the disaster relief from the moment that it happened. And then she gave credit to everybody. But that's very Pearl, her organizational ability and her documentation of it. And she was also very, very involved at the time, just before the earthquake, in the Better Homes of America competition. And it turned out that Santa Barbara tied in 1925 with the city of Atlanta. And this made headlines all across the country that everybody thinks that Santa Barbara's destroyed, but look, no, it won the Better Homes in America in 1925, right after the earthquake. This photograph right here she actually had architectural classes at the high school. And these are a bunch of little Girl Scouts that were working on one of the demonstration houses that helped win the award. But it was a huge boost for Santa Barbara to be able to make these kind of positive headlines rather than the city is destroyed. And they worked very, very hard on the PR aspects of it. So here are the priorities. Get Santa Barbara rebuilt. The first one was you got to rebuild the mission. Oh, sorry. Because that is, as Pearl always said, one of the most widely photographed and publicized buildings in the United States. Every time anybody came to Santa Barbara, what did they want to see? They wanted to see the mission. So spread the word that Santa Barbara is back in good shape and back to normal, and get downtown rebuilt in the Spanish style as soon as they could. And when they developed the relief fund, a percentage of every dollar that was given to the relief fund went to the mission to make sure it would happen really quickly. The other really important and big thing that happened was the creation of the community drafting room and the architectural advisory committee, which of course Bernhard was leading both of them. And the community drafting room was actually an opportunity for individuals and business people to get free architectural assistance in their rebuilding efforts. And it was really seen as a vital part of this, to really get people to appreciate good architecture and how it could happen. And much of it was free. The Hoffmans very significantly donated $17,000, which in today's dollars is like $300,000. So they really wanted this to work. And this little photograph on the right here, is of a cottage that was rebuilt just a few months later as a product of the community drafting room. And they ran these stories all the time as things got rebuilt so that people would know Santa Barbara's back. So right after the earthquake, they still had the fiesta, and they encouraged everybody to wear flowers. And it was a foreshortened fiesta. It was held at Peabody Stadium, and it was just a 2-night kind of an entertainment. But they were determined just to keep going. I love that photograph. That was in the morning press. So Hoffman, he felt, okay, this is the great opportunity, and he really believed that what needed to happen was a widening of State Street, an arcading of all the blocks on State Street. That would be for better lighting and more cohesiveness, but it would also provide an opportunity for more commercial uses. As he put it, the widened street will mean increased purchasing power to the merchant and enhanced appearance that constitute an advertising value for the dealer and the town. Each building its tile in the mosaic, which will joyfully impress the visitor and constantly delight those who are fortunate enough to call the town their own. This is the opportunity. So again, they were putting out this idea that we're going to widen State Street and have lots of vehicles on it, and arcade it to make it really uniform. And one of the things that I think we talked about this last week was it would also mean that it was not shady or sunny on either side. It would just be very comfortable for everyone all the time. And then there was a plan to change the name of State Street to Estado. And they had been changing names kind of organically over time and kind of Americanizing many of the names, but they thought that maybe it was time to go back. And I thought it was interesting that it was Enacapa, Jardín, Laguna Canal, Salsa Puedes. And then on the other side, it was Chapala, spelled a little differently, Vinos, de la Vina, Baños, Bath Street, And so they were organically trying to change the name back to Estado to get that Spanish feel again. It was about a 3-year process, and it's interesting because the newspaper kept calling it Estado, but then the business people didn't want it anymore, and the business people ended up winning, and it went back to State Street. And then Hoffman ran into some trouble. And there was a council member Sweeney, who called it his idea of the arcade and his idea of widening the State Street and his idea of this uniformity was not only dictatorial, it was selfish greed, the thirst for power, and the disregard of citizenship and property rights. So he was ahead of his time, huh? Oh, well, we're not going to blame you. Okay, well, Hoffman was running into some winds here, and he knew it. And as he wrote to Nina Moyse, who was the director of the Community Arts Association, he said, the architectural advisory game is going quite well, but we are in the position of the man on the surfboard. If he stays ahead of the crest of the wave, he may reach the beach. If not, he gets a dousing. So we had the earthquake on June 29th. This is September 2nd, and already he's in trouble. It gets worse. But I mentioned that he had a lot of support and a lot of influential individuals who were his friends. So he started writing all these letters. It's amazing, some of these letters that I got the chance to read. And he wrote to Arthur Brisbane, who was a very prominent columnist across the country for Hearst newspapers. And he wrote to a banker, Otto Kahn, and Christian Herder, the publisher of The Independent. And he asked each one of them to send in letters for PR value. He said, we need them strong and convincing. We need all the help we can get to swing the popular opinion of the day. So he was really mounting this quiet little campaign to get help. And then so I read all of these in letters that I found at the Presidio Research Center. And then looking at the reporting in the newspaper, in the daily press, you would see these letters appear. And it's like, oh, well, his friends did what he asked them to do. But as Dr. Rexwald Brown said, and he was also the head of the Chamber of Commerce, he was obviously he was on Bernhard's side, and he said in 50 years, the citizen then living would pay us homage. But at present, we are 10 years ahead of our time. So they knew that they were doing the right thing, but popular opinion wasn't exactly in line with them. And they couldn't get it done fast enough. And then it got worse because Thomas Stork was not on the Hoffman side. And this is an unbelievable letter that Hoffman wrote to T. Mitchell Hastings, who was an architect and a good friend. He said, speaking of politics, just at the present time, there is the usual acrimonious pre-election discussion raging, and the Storks are playing their usual contemptible role. I wish I were an advertiser so I could have the satisfaction of withdrawing any connection with the paper. That's pretty strong stuff. But what Stork didn't like was he thought that all these people kept coming to Santa Barbara and saying, oh, isn't this wonderful? You're doing this because of the earthquake. You're making it look Spanish. How great. And he didn't like what he said. Those who make flying trips to this city and then write accounts of its architectural features, they seem to think that prior to the disturbance, there was no appreciation of beauty in buildings and no attempt to adapt structures to their surroundings. And of course, Stork had a lot of sway in those days. And I'm going to read to you something that was written in 1929 after all of this, but it was by somebody who sort of gave an account of what happened. He said, it seems but a short time ago that the favorite sport, either indoor or outdoor, was damning Rexwald Brown. Has he reformed? Another nice ladylike expression was, to hell with Bernhard Hoffmann. Has he gone? And he described him as a man of independent means. He said, just previous to that godsend, the earthquake, the committee of men persuaded city council to pass the zoning law and to appoint the Planning Commission. Then came the earthquake, and with it a stream of abuse and vilification on the heads of the luckless commission. Zoning was all wrong, and the commission were all wet. Zowie, what a howl then arose. So his name, he was a prolific letter writer, and his name was, I do have it. No, I do have it. His name was Warren Hanley, and he lived on West Pedregosa Street. And I saw that he wrote many, many letters to the editor, but I couldn't find like what was his. Oh, he was actually a miner in Nevada at one point. But anyway, Stork had everybody stirred up. There's going to be this election, and all of a sudden, with the election and the new people in charge, council adopts a new code abolishing the architectural board. So while we had an architecture board of review, and the first one in the country for a short period of time, it went away pretty quickly. And as Pearl wrote later, she wrote an important story in Noticias in 1959 about all of this. She said a political change ended the city manager form of government, and to Mr. Hoffman's sorrow, and the existence of the architectural board of review. And in her oral history, she said, it broke his heart. So then we entered a period in Santa Barbara of architectural control without the ABR, and then was finally restored in 1947. But we still want to stick where we are, because a year later, Hoffman, while he was no longer on the ABR, he did go back to running the Community Arts Association. He wrote a report on how much had changed and how much Santa Barbara was rebuilding. And in the City Beautiful idea, this was a big full-page story in the Daily Press, and photographs of the housing that was restored, and also many of the buildings. And you'll see that several of them are arcaded the way he wanted it to be. And this was just exactly 1 year to the day afterward. And he called it a community mosaic. And I love that phrase, and I like to use it a lot whenever I'm railing about something. We're a community mosaic, because when you start taking away the little pieces, you no longer have the mosaic. Okay, so Bernhard is sort of licking his wounds, and he still officially plans on planting until 1927, but Pearl took it over. And as she put it, no one else wanted the job. But also true was no one else was as qualified to run the place as she was. And I don't know if it was her experience with Bernhard Hoffmann, because from everything that I've read, he was very mild-mannered, very easy to get along with, very kind and lovely man. But one of her watchwords, and what she used to tell women, was if you want to work with on anything, always get a prominent man to head it up, and then you do the work, but see that he gets the credit. So I like to think that that wasn't the case with Bernhard, but who knows. So the Hoffman family kept their home on Upper Garden Street, but they moved back to Stockbridge. They often wintered here in Santa Barbara. They traveled a great deal in Europe. This is the family: Margaret, Bernhard, the two sons, Walter and Henry, and Irene. And one of the boys went to Yale, another went to Harvard, she went to Mount Holyoke. They were very, very well off and well educated. Oh, sorry. And they did leave their mark in Santa Barbara. And if you go to El Paseo, you will see this mosaic. This is a photograph of 1928 when Herbert Hoover, who was then the president-elect, who came to Santa Barbara. And that's Hoffman on the far right. And actually, Irene is the lady in the hat in the back there. So they remained prominent citizens. People still loved them, and they gave them parties whenever they were in town. They always made the society papers, but he no longer had an official position. But even before the earthquake, and if you go to El Paseo, you will see these two murals as well. The Duke of Alba was really excited about this street in Spain, and he was invited to a reception that was hosted by Charles Fletcher Lummis. We remember him from the Stand Fast Santa Barbara. And Alba said, Santa Barbara, and here he's from Spain, very well educated. He says, my word, it's just like Spain. You have the real atmosphere. Honestly, when I went through Casa de la Guerra this afternoon and the street in Spain, you call it, I thought I was back in Seville. He says, there's nothing sham about your atmosphere. I've seen nothing else like it in the United States. After all, our civilization did start you off here. It's no wonder you've kept some of the original article. And these are both in Spanish, and I have them translated here. And I think my column is in the Independent today with these translated in the Independent. So you can see what they actually say. They're both commemorating how great it is that Hoffman did this. So they continued their good work in Stockbridge. They contributed a great deal of money to the Berkshire Botanical Garden and the library. And sadly, Margaret passed away in 1930. After she went through everything, she passed away in 1933. So in her name, there's a library room and a number of special places in the library dedicated to Margaret. Irene stayed friends with Pearl, and I love this letter that she wrote her. She wrote, "Good luck with all your undertakings. You are certainly doing a monumental job for Santa Barbara, but don't kill yourself doing it. Affectionately yours, Irene Hoffman, 1944. She came back regularly to Santa Barbara, even after Bernhard passed away. And he was given the award by the American Institute of Architects in 1929 as an honorary member of the AIA, which was a very big deal because no non-architect had never received such an award. But he was recognized for all of his work in Santa Barbara. And his obituary in the New York Times, the headline was, "Bernhard Hoffman restored Quake City." And, it's nice that they spelled his name wrong, but at least they gave him credit. So Bernhard died in 1949. Irene continued. She was quite the gardener, and she wrote this book on herb cookery. And then she passed away and donated that huge estate to the garden center in Stockbridge. And Pearl then continued her work. And these are 3 awards from the Better Homes in America. And I think Santa Barbara won like 15 more times until everybody got really sick of them winning. And so they were all like, does Santa Barbara have to enter again? So these are actually out of the university. And they won, these are in the 30s that they won. And she stayed very busy in community activities. Housing was her #1 issue, which is kind of ironic today, isn't it? She went ahead and worked with Julia Morgan, and they opened the Margaret Baylor Inn in 1927. It was, it was planned before the earthquake, and in honor of Margaret Baylor, the really great social worker who Pearl had worked for. And it was a rooming house for women in transit for many, many years. Now they call it the Julia, which kind of bothers me, but I get it. I get it. Okay, so she was also, one of the things that she's not really known for was her environmental ethic. She started something called the California Conservation Council in 1932 and developed this really important conservation attitude about outdoor good manners. And she wrote curriculum for classrooms and had it distributed all around over the state. And she was often the only woman speaker at environmental type conferences across the country. And this is one of the medals that's out at the university of hers. Look at the little guy with the little, that was at Rocky Nook Park. I had a class at Rocky Nook. Is that sweet? Okay, so she instituted the garden tours, and I was just recently at Lotus Land, and I got this picture in my head, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, it looks the same, And so she did a great deal with garden tours. She started the Council of Christmas Cheer, and her big concern, of course, was environment over development, historic preservation. And she even joined and was instrumental with Get Oil Out after the oil spill in 1969. And she, of course, led the battle about the El Marisol, 2 9-story towers that were going to be constructed at the site of Alice Keck Park Memorial Garden today. She was also the Grand Marshal of Fiesta in 1973, and we were able to work out a deal with the university and the Carriage Museum so that her her commemorative ribbon is now on display at the Carriage Museum along with her cowboy boots. The Pearl Chase Society made that happen, so that's really nice. And she actually won an award from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, went to Washington, D.C., was given it by Pat Nixon in the height of Watergate. And she made international headlines because she talked about how wonderful Pat Nixon was and how California was so proud of her. Pat Nixon starts crying, and so Pearl takes the mic and starts talking about preservation and about what we should be doing. And she wasn't, all she was supposed to do is say thank you to the First Lady. That's pretty Pearl, huh? So she received many, many awards. She was Woman of the Year in Santa Barbara. She was Woman of the Year for the Los Angeles Times. This is a medal from the women's clubs and citizens of Santa Barbara. And then she passed away in 1979. And I've always felt bad that I wish she had been able to be the grand dame when Reagan was president, and she could have hosted all of the people and given them the history lessons, and that would have been so wonderful. But sadly, she was at the age of 90. She passed away and was written up in the Los Angeles Times and the New York and the local papers, of course. I found this picture of her at a street in Spain, but actually in Spain. There she is in Barcelona as a kind of elderly lady. And this is a logo. Well, it's a quilt panel that was created for the International Women's Quilt that was inspired by the work of Judy Chicago. And 3 women from Santa Barbara created this quilt triangle, which is the motif for all of them. And they wanted to express their appreciation for her being the phoenix rising from the earthquake. And you can see that what it looks like rubble underneath the bird of paradise. So I think it's kind of wonderful that she's a part of the International Women's Quilt, which is in Louisville, Kentucky. So there are many, many accolades written about Bernhard Hoffmann. Bernhard Hoffmann tried to perpetuate the best in the spirit of this city. The city might, in simple, honest settlement of a debt, try to perpetuate here some of the best in the spirit of Bernhard Hoffmann. And then I love this quote of Pearl. If she would be satisfied in heaven after stirring things up here in Santa Barbara. And there's something sweet about her being there at the Plans and Planting, what got them together so long ago. And then 1 year after the earthquake, Irving R. Murrow wrote in The Architect and the Engineer, a small community has set itself the goal of being not a second-rate or third-rate large city, but the best possible small community. And I think that we still try to do that. I hope we try to do that. Sometimes I think we want to be a big city, and we might not want to do that. But yeah, that is it. I will read you one other comment about Bernhard. This was a tribute because Thomas Stork finally came around, and in his tribute to Bernhard Hoffmann in 1949, he wrote, "His contribution should have been a lasting inspiration to keep the town's charm going. Alas, newcomers without his vision have hacked and hauled down and revamped buildings of integral beauty on State Street for slabs, so-called modern, not even worthy modern, stems from Hispanic and ancestral architecture." So I think that Hoffman was very well respected in his day, and I'm sorry that his legend has been somewhat lost over the years. So I might have to do something about that. Yay! And of course Irene, we love Irene. Yeah. So
It's an interesting photograph because it looks like it's from the 50s or something like that, but the parking garage is there.
Yeah, it does. It's I don't know. I think maybe it's a painting. I'm not sure if it's actually a painting. I don't know, but I thought it was kind of evocative of we are a small town, and sometimes we act like we're a huge city, and we're not, and we need to remember that. Yeah. Does anybody have any questions or comments or anything? Yeah.
I'm curious about the friction between Thomas Stork and Bernhard Hoffmann, and I didn't quite get that. Like, what? Because they're pretty acrimonious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it was that Stork felt that there were interlopers, including Hoffman, who hadn't been here. And although it was Hoffman's money and his vision and his idea, and frankly, his Laurel Hill Association, which helped flower the whole idea of the Spanish revival, it was his idea. I think Stork was jealous of him. And it was a, do you have anything on that? And more than on that?
That's an interesting view. It may be, although Stork was, he didn't like being told what to do.
Yeah, and there was a lot of that. A lot of people felt that it was dictatorial, and so that was probably as much a part of it as well. Yeah, he did come around eventually, as he came around even on El Marisol. So he did change his mind about things, but yeah, it was kind of, it's really sad. It's really sad.
I'm interested in the ordinance for that was passed before the earthquake. Was Hoffman involved in the phrasing or the organizing of that?
Oh yes, he was one of the vigilante Hispanicizers. Yes, he was completely, yeah, he was involved. He was on the planning commission. He was right there with everybody else.
Can you remind
Yeah.
us of the timing?
That would have been 1924. Yeah, and just before the earthquake. I think that the zoning ordinance actually passed like 2 weeks before. I mean, it was crazy, but they had been working on it quite a bit. That was the vision. But they had, and there are articles where they say it would have taken them decades to come up with this idea. And his arcade and the, really ambitious plans that they had could never have happened unless there was something like the God-given earthquake that the fellow.
I don't know if I mentioned this last week, but in October of 1925, in one of the LA papers, somebody wrote, "Why can't we have an earthquake so we can redo scrubby parts of LA?"
Yeah, Hoffman did a great deal of outreach to newspaper people and all of his contacts to get them in to see what was going on. He wanted them to see what had happened and what they had planned. And he was a pretty confident guy. And I just think it's really a shame that they didn't give him more opportunity to carry out, because again, I hadn't realized how wealthy and how generous they were. And they might have done a great deal more in Santa Barbara.
No good deed goes unpunished.
As you know. Yes.
It's interesting that you're talking about the fact that Pro Chase helped to prevent 8-story towers from coming into Dallas Pet Park Gardens. Can we channel her? Back of the
Oh, really? Actually, it was 9-story, 2 9-story. Yeah, we're going to have to figure out how we're going to, all of us channel our inner Pearl to make this happen. And I think what I'm really hopeful for is that the increased knowledge that people are going to get as a result of EQ25 is going to remind people of some of these stories they just don't know, and increase their knowledge about how things have been in Santa Barbara in the past and how they ought to stay. So that's my hope, is that we'll be able to benefit from that.
To piggyback off of his question, is there any individual or a group that has such an influence for preservation and keeping the integrity of what we know of Santa Barbara today on a beautification level and development? And then another question is to that, how has the government changed, such as commissions, today than when it was in the past? If there has been any difference, making it more difficult or rather easier if someone had a voice today to speak on behalf of
Boy, those are both big questions. As far as an organization, I'm on the board of the Pearl Chase Society. We do the absolute best that we can do. There's Santa Barbara Beautiful, there's Citizens Planning. Those are all organizations that started many, many years ago and have various parts of what you're talking about. Of course, there's Trust for Historic Preservation, but they're not as, they're pretty much on their property, not as much on the bigger properties. It's very difficult these days, and there aren't as many people involved as there were in Pearl's day. And there was constant news about it, and there were constantly people involved in these various organizations. It's just not the same as it used to be. Again, I'm hopeful that as a result of this new awareness from 100 years ago, we can help develop that. I hope that comes out of this summer's activities. And the other thing about the boards and commissions, I don't feel qualified to really discuss that. We have a couple of commission members, if anybody would like to say something about that. It's just that I think they change over time based on the zeitgeist and what the popular thing is. And right now, development is really on everybody's mind. But as I read last week, we had an article from Pearl in 1920 talking about how it was so expensive to build housing, and small homes is what she always wanted here in Santa Barbara. So I don't know. Do any of you go?
HLC has always been pretty consistent.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes.
Some of the other boards, not as much.
Yes, I will agree. And we have a new member of the HLC, which is great. Sheila Lodge. Sheila Lodge is going to be on it. That's wonderful. And yes, the HLC is vitally important. And probably without their help, Rick and I and another friend of ours, probably we would not have prevailed with the Anapamu Stone Pines, which was, that's a pretty significant community resource to work on.
This is the architect for the 9-story building at Leslie, the local architect.
Well, that's what I read this week. I read that that's the case. It's coming through their office. I wouldn't know that they actually designed it. This whole builder's remedy thing really gets things very, very murky. I'm just channeling all my energy into that historic spot, and the inaccessibility of that spot is going to fire. Absolutely. Yeah, I'm hopeful that I understand that I'm going to have to do an EIR. Yeah, if that happens, I can't imagine that they would be allowed to create a project of that magnitude. So we'll see.
Well, I think there's also
And all this historic stonework. I mean, it's pretty. My daughter used to go to Waldorf school. I know that entrance really well. That was hard then, Yeah.
But it didn't get improved 5 years ago, so maybe you can't escape.
Yeah,
So
we'll see.
You shouldn't put that many people there.
Yeah, we will see. I think we all have to put our efforts into it. I've been thinking, because I am a journalist, that what we need to do is take advantage of the fact that this is a 100th year anniversary. That is the most prominent building in America, and get an article or at least an editorial in the Washington Post and the New York Times to say the iconic building is being threatened. And I think that might carry some weight. That's my thought.
I'm struck by something you suggested, and I'd like you to expand on it a little bit, if there's any truth to what I remember. The fact that State Street was not a great business avenue, and the business community was really pushing for change. And fast forward 100 years now, and that State Street business is not doing as well, and the business community is pushing for a lot of change. So is that a real parallel there? Did I just make that up? What do you see?
Let me read what the gentleman from 1929 wrote about that, because I think it is somewhat of a parallel. And okay, he said after what I wrote, the vilification, did it stop this group of visionaries? It did not. Business was as usual with them. After the earthquake, Bernhard Hoffmann told Rexwald Brown that it was the time to start the distinctive architecture that we boast of now. But then it literally had to be forced down our throats, and force it on us they did. To Bernhard Hoffmann, we owe the credit to the idea. To Rexwald Brown and his pugnacious tenacity, we owe the credit for forcing us against our will to build right. And to the committee, we owe thanks for backing up Mr. Hoffman and Dr. Brown to the limit. And then he says, the following city council disbanded the planning commission and the board of review, but in the few months that they were existing, they started Santa Barbara on the road to fame and beauty. And this is really cool. It says, and now, when John Smith of Oshkosh visits you, or when Jane Doe writes you from Paris, and both sing the same song, I love you, Santa Barbara, think of Bernhard Hoffmann. And he said that they think back to how the dimes were previous to the time that damned planning commission made a real town out of a Sleepy Hollow village. He really appreciated the heavy hand that these gentlemen tried to use, and maybe it was a little heavy-handed. I don't know, but I think before that they didn't have any rules, so they were going to chafe about them. Yeah. So is it realistic? I don't know. I don't know any business owners on State Street, but something has to change, and maybe 100 years later it will. Yes, Sheila.
I don't know if you're aware that Bernhard Hoffmann was inspired by Oha.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In the arcade there.
That happened.
Yeah.
It was Libby.
Yes.
Was a major mass glass manufacturer in the Midwest, and he had a summer fishing camp in Ojai, and he didn't like the way he looked. And what they did is they tore down the facades. Well, it's in my book. There's a picture of Ojai before this happened, and it looks like it's straight out of a Western movie set. Wood sidewalks, wood fronts, and they just took that away and built what's there now.
And that's what he wanted to do. One thing that I didn't get into, and I'm going to be talking about in a couple of weeks, is that Hoffman actually went to the Chicago World's Fair in 1893 against his father's wishes, and that was the first time that he saw any Spanish colonial anything. And he was a very young man. He was only 19 years old, but I like to think that got him started.
Well, and California's exhibit there was in the Spanish colonial.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure you went to Paris, and the Route of Italy is all arcaded there too, so it's not Spanish, but.
And he was trying to recreate Bologna. That was his idea as well. All these people were very well traveled. Yeah, they had been to Spain a lot, and there were a lot of articles in the local press about people coming and going from Spain, and everything Spanish was exotic and wonderful. They were all enthused by it, so the timing was just right. Yeah. Anybody else?
And it was the Roaring 20s.
Yeah. And there were very, very wealthy people who wanted to invest in this town. Yes.
You mentioned Kevin Starr, who I really got a lot out of his material dreams. Kevin Starr talks about Bernhard Hoffmann at some point, because there's a short period after the earthquake, then like next February, he's
gone
out. At some point, Kevin Starr, he pictures him as this person who can go to him and he'll give you tips on how to make things. It's almost like a voluntary de facto architectural board of review of one person, and he would kind of like not maybe physically stamp it, but say, yeah, this is good, So
that was the community drafting room, because he basically financed it. I mean, he had his finger in many, many pies, but he kind of had the right to, and he certainly had the vision. And I keep going back to that Laurel Hill Association. He had grown up with this idea of community beautification, and how perfect to take it from New England into kind of New Spain. And I think Pearl called him a practical idealist. And I like that phrasing, but I think he was a very big thinker. And he did a great deal in just the time that he had here.
Or Irene was.
Well, Irene did a lot too. Yeah. And one of the wonderful and generous things that they did when they bought Casa de la Guerra, the de la Guerra's daughters were still living there, and they made it possible for the rest of for anybody in the family to continue to live there the rest of their lives. And Irene was taking lessons from Delfina. She was taking Spanish lessons. Pearl took Spanish lessons from her as well. So they were very benevolent and respectful of this community. And they often had parties. They had a party, for example, when it first opened up, when the street in Spain opened, they had a big autumn party, and they invited everybody. And I love that reconstruction party that they had just days after the earthquake. And they kind of came up with it all.
And that was in the Casa de la Guerra.
Yeah.
Not the opposite.
Yeah. So, okay. Yeah, well, there we go.